Hey third graders, Miss Wilson here, and today we're going to talk about how to compare and contrast when we're writing a paragraph. So let's get into it. The first thing we need to do is make sure that we understand the prompt so that we answer it correctly. Our prompt for this week says, write a paragraph in which you compare and contrast the rush for gold and gold rush success stories. Tell how the selections are similar and different. Identify details from the selections to support your ideas. Well, first of all, compare and contrast we know means to find the things that are the same and different. We need to be using both texts from this week. The first text is the Rush for Gold, which we read on Monday and Tuesday, and Gold Rush Success Stories is the second text that we read on Wednesday and Thursday. Let's start off with the basics. Well, this paragraph, because it's a paragraph, has to be around 5 to 6 sentences, and we'll talk about what the sentences should be in just a second. Remember, because this is a compare and contrast paragraph, we have to make sure that we talk about both what is the same and what is different between the two texts. We also need to be able to prove how we know they're different or how we know they're the same by using evidence from both texts. Now remember, I said that this paragraph should be about 5 to 6 sentences. Now, this is where I get that number from. Your first sentence should be your topic sentence. This is like our controlling main idea. It's going to tell your reader what you're about to write about. Here's an example. The Rush for Gold and Gold Rush Success Stories have many similarities and differences. I'm telling my reader what two texts I'm going to be comparing and contrasting. My next sentence needs to make sure that I am telling the differences or the similarities. I put compare first, but you can do either one. Then you need to make sure that you have evidence from the text. You want to pick a text or use both to be able to back up what you're saying. The next sentence is going to be contrast, or compare if you did contrast first. Here you're going to say how the texts are similar or the same. You also want to include evidence for this portion so that you can prove to your reader that you really know how they're the same by using the sentences from the stories. And lastly, you should have a conclusion sentence. This is a lot like your topic sentence. You're going to still tell your reader what your paragraph is about, but you're going to use a couple of different words. For example, mine says, as you can see, both the texts may have some differences, but they also have a lot of things in common. So this right here shows the outline of what your paragraph can look like too. Make sure that you include the topic, the compare sentence with evidence, a contrast sentence with evidence, and a conclusion. So the first thing we have to do before we can even write our paragraph is to make sure that we know the differences and the similarities between both texts. So the first thing we're going to do is analyze both texts and see if we can find anything that's the same and anything that's different. The way that I'm going to be able to tell what's different and what's the same is by using this graphic organizer called a Venn diagram. A Venn diagram is when we use two circles to tell the differences and the similarities between texts. In the middle where it overlaps is where we write anything that was the same. So the way I'm going to start is by thinking about everything I remember about the Rush for Gold. Well, I remember in that story that James Wilson Marshall found gold on his boss Sutter's property. People heard about the gold and they came to California to find it. Even though a lot of people searched for gold, only a few actually really made a lot of money. Because so many people rushed to California, the population really increased. But some of the mining towns were abandoned when the rush for gold was over, and they were called ghost towns. That's what I remember about a rush for gold. What about gold rush success stories? Well, in this story, it focused on two people who found success outside of gold. Even though it started talking about how they went to California to find gold, these two people were actually successful without finding gold. Levi Strauss invented the blue jeans to help the miners. It says in the story that they were able to create pants that helped the miners so that they could be digging and it lasted way longer. Samuel Clemens became a famous writer. He also tried to find gold, and he liked to listen to the stories of the other miners, and he wrote it down. And that helped him to become a successful writer. Now, what was the same about the two stories? Well, definitely they were both about the gold rush. They both talked about what different miners did. Here in the Rush for Gold, it talked about how some of the miners became farmers after the gold rush, and it also talked about that in Gold Rush success stories too. And it also mentioned how some other people found different jobs, just like Levi Strauss and Samuel Clemens. Both stories talked about how not everybody found gold. So now that I remember what the two stories were about and some of the similarities, one thing that I want to do is maybe think of a controlling main idea, or my main idea, just like we do when we're writing our prompts. What do I notice all of these bullets have in common? Well, it looks to me like the rush for gold is mostly about the history of the gold rush. And gold rush success stories, when I look at what I have written down, it looks to me like the thing they have in common is that it's talking about two people and how they were successful without finding gold, even though they went to go find gold. So these are the two things that I noticed that are different. All right, third graders, now that we've got some stuff written down, we need evidence. We have to ask ourselves, what does the text say? But seriously, we need to be able to prove what we're saying to our reader by giving proof from the text. So how do we do that? Well, we'll need to look in the text to find quotes or lines from the story that prove that what we're saying is true. So let's look at our first difference. Our first difference comes from the rush for gold. We said that mostly this is about the history of the gold rush. Well, I can prove that by finding a quote in the text. In this case, I found a quote that says, "California's gold was no longer a secret. The rush for gold had begun. Some people called it gold fever." I can prove that this text is going to be talking about California and gold fever because I have a text quote right here that shows my reader that yes, this text is talking about California and the gold. What about some of our similarities? Well, we said that both stories mention gold. I found this quote from the Success Stories article that said, "Thousands of people packed up their belongings. They traveled by steamship or stagecoach to the dusty hills of California." So now I can see that in both the rush for gold and in our success stories, they both talk about gold. I can prove that to my reader by showing those quotes. Another difference we mentioned was that the Success Stories article was different because it didn't talk about how men were successful with gold, but it talked about how they found success even if they didn't find gold. Here's a quote. For example, one man, Levi Strauss, sold pants made especially for miners. Samuel Clemens, another person hoping to make his fortune, published the tales he heard at the mining camps. So now we can see that this story is not exactly like the rush for gold because it's not really telling the history of how people made it to California and heard about the gold. It's mostly talking about how these two men were able to be successful in their lives even though they didn't find gold. Lastly, one of our other similarities was that both stories also mention how people found different jobs in California. This quote says, "Instead of leaving California, many miners stayed and found other jobs. They became farmers and ranchers and helped turn California into an important food-growing state." Now this quote comes from the rush for gold. It's showing us that even though people were going to California, because not a lot of people found gold, many other people had to find different jobs. And both of the texts talk about that. So you can see that I can prove to my readers that I know what I'm talking about because I was able to find evidence from the text. Just as a reminder, now that we've reviewed what our differences are and what our similarities are, Now what you're going to have to do is think about how you could complete these sentences. The topic sentence and the conclusion sentence are already done for you. You just need to go back to the text and think to yourself, what was one of the ways that we talked about that was different? Can I find some evidence from the text to prove that I know that that's how they're different? What about how are they the same? What did both texts talk about? And how do you know? Can you prove it by showing me a quote from the text? So just as a very quick review, remember, as you're writing your paragraph, you need to be thinking about that your paragraph should really just include a topic sentence. This is like your controlling main idea. Tells your reader what you're going to be writing about. You need to make sure that most of your sentences are your compare and contrast sentences with evidence. This is where you're telling us the different reasons and the different proof that you have for how they are the same and how they're different. And you're going to end with one sentence that's a conclusion. This one is just to restate your topic sentence, and it's just to end things nicely. Here's some quick tips, just some recommendations to make sure that you're successful in your paragraph. Use the stories. They're there to help you. The stories should help you so you can look back at them and find your own text evidence so you can find some quotes to prove to your reader. You can't really know how they're the same or how they're different if you haven't read them, so make sure that you do that. Use the sentence starters that I gave you. I'm going to post a picture next to the form that you're going to use to write your paragraph, and it's going to show you the slide that has the different sentences, like your topic sentence, your compare and contrast, and I've started the sentences for you. You can use those or make your own. Remember to use what you know about sentences. Start with a capital letter and end with a period so I know that one sentence has ended and a new one is about to begin. And remember to always do your best. Don't forget to reach out to your teachers if you have any questions. Don't be afraid. Don't stress. We know that it's difficult, but we are going to work with you. So do your best and let us know if you have any questions.